Okay, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you for joining us today. Hope are ready for day 2 of the annual convening and enjoyed yesterday's session and opening plenary. My name is Stephanie Garys. I am a technical assistant specialist at the PDG B-5 TA Center. I support Region 5 states. And I am joined today by Lori Connors-Tadros, who is a senior research fellow with the National Institute of Early Education Research and is a partner in the center leadership team. We're also going to be joined by 4 state presenters. So before we get going, let's address a few housekeeping items. So if you haven't done so already, if you could just change your name in Zoom, just share your first and last name and identify the state that you're from. It'll just be kind of nice to know who's in the room, and we will be going into breakout rooms later on. So this next slide, this is very important for the breakout rooms. If you happen to join by phone and I didn't scroll through the participants, it's important to make sure that you switch to phone audio so that when you go to a breakout room, it goes with you. Okay, so let me kind of talk a little bit about the objectives for today. We would really like to, just build capacity for sustainability planning. We'll be talking about some resources and kind of that will guide you through the process. And then we're going to hear about some state approaches, some approaches that they have taken and some planning steps from a couple of other states. And then, as I said earlier, we're going to have time for peer discussion. So I wanted to share this quote with you. Last year, we hosted a sustainability planning work group. We had about 8 states that joined us. And throughout the work group, we shared resources and tools. We had great discussions just about specific questions that states have, challenges they may be facing, or any best practices that they have found. And we also had some time when we were having the work group, that's when all the COVID relief dollars were released. So we had opportunity to really kind of talk through that and how we could use those funds. So I just thought that this quote, if you're not, ready to jump on the sustainability planning, hopefully this quote will kind of spur you on. So first, let me go ahead and introduce our state speakers before we get going. So we have Lindsay Dorneman from Colorado and Matt Kane from Minnesota. And then we will have Christina LaChance from New Hampshire and Tom Lehman from Illinois. So I am going to, as we get started, I'm going to be turning it over to Lori. She'll talk a little bit about sustainability planning, and then we will have Matt and Lindsay share their approaches that they have used. And we'll have some time for questions and answers at that time. We'll have like a block of time there. But please feel free along the way to put any questions or thoughts in the chat. And then after that, we'll turn it over to Christina and Tom. And then we'll go into breakout rooms. We'll have breakout rooms for about 15 minutes. And then we'll have time to come back and just share, report out on that. So I am going to turn it over to Lori.
Thank you so much, Stephanie, and welcome. Good morning or good afternoon to everybody that's joined us today for the second day of the annual convening. And I was able to listen in and join some of the sessions yesterday. The federal panel was really inspiring and important as a context for sustainability planning, given both the Federal Recovery Act dollars, but the Build Back Better and all of the work that you're doing. So I'm pretty passionate about sustainability planning, and that is because I had so many experiences, as you have, implementing really terrific programs, new projects that I felt really met the needs of children and families. that were funded by time-limited grants, whether they were federal dollars or private dollars or even sometimes state or local dollars. And it was always pretty frustrating when we felt we actually had done some good and learned some things that we couldn't sustain it. So a number of years ago, I had the opportunity to do a lot more work in financing and sustainability, particularly around human services programs. And so I'll share with you some tools and resources there. But I want to begin with why it's important is, as I said, and as you know, you all have been working very hard to implement specific grant activities and reach specific goals for your PDG B-5 in order to move the system forward, to make it more coherent, to strengthen the connections, to provide access for children and families to services that they need. And so the minute you get the federal grant, as daunting as it is, or any time-limited dollars, it's really important to start thinking about sustainability planning. I think you're going to hear from, you will hear from both Colorado and from Minnesota, you know, what processes they've used, because it does take, it takes time. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what are the key decisions you have to make and what is an approach you can use. The first key decision is actually, what is it that you want to sustain? What's your more or less unit of analysis? The title of this workshop is actually the PDG B-5 achievements, but it may be that you want to think about what is the state strategic priorities. How have the activities and projects that you've funded with PDG dollars and other dollars move that forward, and then what needs to be sustained? So in other words, it could be very focused on just the grant and the projects you funded with those dollars, which are important because sometimes that's people and particular services, but it also could be a larger, how do we sustain our momentum in building the system? So that's the first decision you have to make. The second is who should be involved. And this is always a very challenging decision-making process, because you want a group that kind of has enough of a background and understanding and can influence funding and decisions like this, but you don't want a very large group. And you may have other processes by which you do get feedback, and all of you have done needs assessments and strategic plans and stakeholder engagement, so you use that. But the group that's planning for sustainability has to have folks with a finance background, budgeting background, programmatic background, and really somebody can kind of pull all that together. And then the final thing to think about from the beginning, not really the final, but one of the key decisions to think about from the beginning is who would have to take this, who would actually have the power, authority, to take the plan and actually make it actionable. Because I know you all have probably been in many situations where you develop a plan and it sits on a shelf and no one takes any action. Very important to think about who needs to be involved from the beginning to make this actionable, and that will also come through in how you craft the plan. As I mentioned, there are actually a lot of resources out there about sustainability planning, many of them actually developed by federal agencies around when we had the Race to the Top K-12 early and the Early Learning Challenge, and then the previous preschool development grant. So there are a lot of resources and tools and rubrics. There are examples of what sustainability plans might look like. And you probably know that you are required to write to how you are going to think about sustainability in your renewal grant. But what we share is a very comprehensive and somewhat methodical approach to sustainability planning. And we have a tool and sets of resources that's very actionable and would help you facilitate and engage those folks I talked about that needed to be involved in both, you know, crafting it or decision making. And we go through these key elements, which I'm going to briefly speak about, just so you have the context. As I mentioned, the first one is to really determine your goals. And that could be, we are just sustaining XYZ program, or we want to achieve XYZ for children or families. You all are in a great position that you have your needs assessment, and you have, many of you have strategic plans or in the process of updating them or refining them. So you have a set of strategic priorities. Very, very important to stay focused on that. Sometimes I say that the sustainability plan is in part a strategic plan, an evaluation plan, and your finance plan rolled up into one, so that they all kind of interrelate. Second, being clear on the results that you want to achieve with the sustainability plan. So for example, a very reasonable goal might be that you want to ensure that you have the capacity at the state level to support the collaborative relationships that you've built. Typically, collaboration is not built into the FTE of specific roles at the state level, and you may need to do that. You may have been able to hire a program manager or a coordinator with this grant, and that is invaluable. And it might be that you believe, because collaboration and coordination is so important, you actually want to continue to sustain that. Or it may be that you want to build out your data system, or you want to build out a parent campaign, whatever it is. But as you probably know from other efforts around strategic planning, focusing on 3 to 5 key results is very, very helpful in kind of honing your focus of the sustainability plan. We talk quite a bit about financing, both the costs of things as they are currently being implemented, the cost to sustain them at what level for what time period, as well as potential revenue sources and how to leverage additional funding. In some cases, if you've been through having federal grants, you are able to fund at certain levels within your state budget or with other sources. Or in some cases, you have to make the decision that this particular program or service might sunset because of financing. The next 3 are actually especially critical. And I think in early childhood, we've learned this over and over, but with the pandemic, we really have seen the results of the fact that if you have a broad base of support, which right now early childhood has a pretty broad base of support, whether money gets attached to that and whether there's a clear understanding of what high quality early childhood is and what a system is still probably we're working on. But really important, all of the efforts you've done to engage stakeholders, now's also the time as you engage in sustainability planning to help them think about the fact that part of what you've been doing and successful at is actually funded with time-limited funds. Very important to gain key champions. That's usually folks that have some influence, might be a legislator, might be a business group, whatever it is in your state. And this is where your knowledge of your state and actually communities are really, really critical. But attending to both the people part and the dollar part and the outcome part in sustainability planning is really, really important. And that's where the adapting to changing conditions might mean. Of course, everybody will think of the pandemic right now, but it also could be you have an upcoming election. You have a change in your state budget. There's a variety of things that could be happening that you want to think about. How can you adapt rather quickly or nimbly, be prepared to pivot as needed. Building strong internal systems is all about accountability. You all are in public, for the most part, public positions funded by the state, accountable to the consumers, and ensuring you have strong internal systems, both document financing and how the funds are being spent and who is benefiting from them is really important, and in part because that data helps you build your case. Finally, I would say we really advocate and have seen the benefit of actually developing a plan. This doesn't mean it's a 100-page report. It could be a PowerPoint of 5 pages or 5 slides. It could be a very succinct, trifold, or it could be a longer thing. It's really your decision, and it's intended to guide efforts beyond the time limited funding, whether it's federal funds or not. And it's also intended to communicate with other stakeholders. So in essence, as Stephanie mentioned, we hosted a sustainability work group last year, of which Christina at New Hampshire, Illinois, Colorado, Minnesota, I noticed someone from Nebraska is on the line. They participated, and we took each one of these elements and talked about it, shared strategies, and you're going to hear in a minute what Colorado and Minnesota did because they've kind of moved along in their process, and Illinois and New Hampshire are preparing to do so. So we are offering a sustainability work group this year. You've been notified about that. I think we have 6 states that have signed up. We will begin in October. So if you're interested in participating in that work group, or you have questions about it, or just want to chat about sustainability planning and don't really have time to participate in the work group, please email Samantha Payton, who is my co-lead on the project coming up. And Stephanie, if you could put her email address in the chat box, we would be really happy to talk to you or to have you be a part of that group. Please also, when you put it in the chat box, put your email so we have that right there as well. I'm going to now start really turning it over to the people that have been doing this work. And, honestly, Stephanie and I were just so pleased at how engaged folks were. And everybody is on a different path, and their processes are different, and, how they're approaching this. But both Matt and Lindsay from Colorado are going to present to you both unique to their state, but you'll see common elements of how they approached it. So I'm going to introduce Matt Kane. He's a management analyst and development from the Minnesota, I think, Department of Ed. I'm not actually sure, but I know what I do know about him is he's really fantastic to work with, really engaged, both sharing what he's learning and asking questions. And I know you're going to be really very thrilled with the presentation. And please feel free to put any questions in the chat. We will have a Q&A right after Matt and Lindsay. And I know Matt also will help facilitate any follow-up questions. But Matt, thank you so much for being willing to share, and looking forward to hearing your presentation.
Thanks very much, Lori. I'll try to live up to that. Thank you. Just by way of background, I work for the state of Minnesota in a unit that helps other state agencies with a range of projects. Management analysis and development is what we're called. And in this case, our unit is helping with the sustainability planning for PDG B-5 that's cross-agency in Minnesota, as I'm sure it is in most states. So I know a lot about the sustainability effort, a little less about Minnesota's PDG funded work. The key contact for that broader effort is Amanda Varley. I'll just put her email in the chat in case you've got questions about Minnesota's efforts overall. But today I want to give you a sense for how Minnesota has come at this issue of sustainability planning. I'll share the key questions we've used to frame our sustainability work, and I'll talk about the steps we've taken or that we plan to take soon to position ourselves for sustaining PDG funded programs and initiatives. You'll see as I walk through this that we in Minnesota have emphasized a step-by-step process to move from identifying what to sustain through to approaches and planning for how to sustain it. I'll focus on that process for sustainability planning, and Lindsay Dorneman from Colorado, who's up next, is going to focus more on operationalizing the plan. So next slide. To get at this sustainability work, we recognized going in that we would need to look at both what Minnesota should sustain and how Minnesota could sustain it. And so from those two areas of inquiry, we framed up 3 key questions for sustainability planning, and they're up there on the slide. What PDG funded work is suitable to sustain? What PDG funded work does Minnesota want to sustain? What's desirable here? And what approaches can Minnesota apply to its PDG funded work when it comes to key sustainability levers? So what can we do to make it feasible? Next slide. As a first step, we identified 35, how's that for scary? 35 elements of preschool development work that were tied to the federal grant, and that is a lot. We took that initial list of 35 PDG funded elements to the PDG leads at the 4 agencies in Minnesota. These are the point players for the effort. And we went through that list with them to identify what was suitable to sustain using 3 basic questions here on the slide. You know, what's ongoing and suitable to sustain? What's a one-time effort that may not be suitable to sustain? It was a toolkit, it's a one and done. What PDG funded elements are one-time under the grant, but might be valuable to sustain going forward. And through this process, thank goodness, we were able to narrow down the list from 35 to about a dozen PDG funded elements that were suitable to sustain. Next slide. And then next up, we engaged a broader group of folks who are in the know about Minnesota's PDG funded work in order to identify what Minnesota would want to sustain from the list of PDG funded elements suitable to sustain, right? So we went from that suitability to desirability. And for this, we turned again to PDG leads at the 4 agencies and to a group of agency staff that lead the specific PDG funded programs and initiatives. So these are people overall who are very familiar with Minnesota's PDG work, familiar enough that they could apply criteria to the list of PDG funded elements suitable to sustain in order to figure out what they want to sustain. So with input again from those key PDG contacts, we developed a list of criteria for the groups to use, and we asked them to consider the ones that are up here on the slide. So the direct impact on children and families, the impact on systems, impact on equity, bang for the buck, and the missing piece. And we asked them to rate those dozen PDG funded elements that we thought were suitable to sustain. We asked them to rate it across these 5 criteria, either based on known effectiveness or potential impacts. And we asked them to consider both the breadth and the depth of the impacts. And here's the shocker. I hope you're sitting down. The ratings resulted in our follow-up discussion sessions also confirmed this, that there was support for including all of the PDG funded elements identified as suitable to sustain in the list of what Minnesota wants to sustain. So all of the dozen or so elements that we were considering, they said, hey, move it to the next stage for figuring out what's feasible. And honestly, that's not surprising. We felt we had to go through that step, but remember that the state agencies and their staff had only recently identified all these early childhood development work, as useful to carry out under the PDG grant. And they did this in the planning stage. So, you know, surprise, surprise, they said, boy, it all looks good. Next slide. We then turned to how Minnesota can sustain the PDG funded elements that were suitable to sustain and the state wanted to sustain. And for this stage of the planning process, we did some homework. We conducted research to identify, define, and explain important sustainability levers for public programs and initiatives. And we came up with a list here of 7 drawing from the reference research. You are going to recognize a lot of these because many of them line right up with what Lori just walked through for the sustainability planning workbook. And so, yes, there's a lot of overlap here. Some tweaks that we did based on considerations in Minnesota. So it's funding, it's that support idea from champions and others. It's organization and governance, management systems, staff and expertise, program rules that allow for or hinder coordination, collaboration, and funding from multiple sources, and adaptability to leadership changes and shifting opportunities and priorities. Next slide. We now have a good list of 7 key sustainability levers to apply to the PDG funded elements that Minnesota wants to sustain, and opening the door to look at feasible approaches for how the state might want to sustain these important initiatives. We wanted to gather input and insights from stakeholders and PDG leaders on ways to apply those 7 levers to the PDG funded elements. And going into the project, when we were planning it out, we thought we'd use small group discussions for this, but that was before we knew we had 11 PDG funded elements to sustain and 7 levers to consider for each of them. So we ruled that out. The small group discussions is just unmanageable. And instead, we compiled an online questionnaire and circulated it to about 70 contacts inside and outside government. We got a great response rate. It was about 75%. This survey approach to the information led participants, it let them hone in on which elements they were familiar with. They didn't have to answer about all of them. It let them answer questions for the number, whatever number was going to work for them. And I think that helped with the response. If we weren't going to have time to answer them all, which ones do you really want to focus on? So for each of the PDG funded elements that respondents chose to help us with, we asked them the same set of questions for all 7 of those levers. We asked them to rate the importance of the lever to the PDG funded element because, hey, if it isn't important, do we want to spend a lot of time worrying about it, right? We asked them to rate how well positioned the PDG funded element is for sustainability when it comes to each of the levers. And then for the last 2 bullet points there on the slide, we asked in effect that they share their ideas for applying the levers to the PDG funded elements. Next slide. We at Management Analysis and Development, where I work, we are now compiling and analyzing the results from the online questionnaire, and we're documenting ideas and insights for applying the 7 sustainability levers to each of the 11 elements. We're using a template we've developed, complete with a table up front that kind of summarizes the element-specific approaches and challenges across the 7 levers. Once that analysis and reporting is complete, we'll move to the next stage of our sustainability planning effort. We will coordinate and facilitate a series of initial planning meetings for implementation and action. And these implementation planning sessions are expected to involve PDG leads and possibly others as appropriate to build upon the approaches that were shared by the respondents to the online questionnaire, again, applying those levers to the elements. It is at these sessions where we'll draw upon all the other sustainability work we've carried out, kind of roll up our sleeves for what's feasible in the last year of the grant. And then finally, we'll produce a written sustainability guide or plan, and that document is expected to present information, analysis, and findings from each step of the effort, including, of course, the implementation planning sessions. The PDG agency and project leads will be able to draw on that report as they work to sustain the PDG work in the last year. So that is my really quick, Matt talks fast, sum of our PDG sustainability work. As I said at the start, we've followed that kind of step-by-step process to identify what we want to sustain and then looking at how we might want to do it. And it all looks really clean and orderly in these slides, but do know that we've adjusted our approach throughout the project, be practical and to keep it on target. And so I hope that was helpful. And what I will do, I'm not going to take questions now. We've got a time for questions after the next presentation. And up next is Lindsay Dorneman from Colorado, who I referenced, is going to be talking about operationalizing the sustainability plan. So Lindsay, take it away.
Great, thank you, Matt. Hi, everyone. I'm Lindsay Dorneman, and I lead the Colorado PDG B-5 work in Colorado, and definitely would put in a plug for the sustainability work group. Next slide, please. One of the advantages of being part of the work group means you get to borrow from other states. And so as a member of that group, I found Minnesota's process, particularly the 3 questions Matt shared, useful as we organize the information that would help our leadership make decisions regarding which strategies to sustain and the next steps for Colorado. So the following slides are going to illustrate how we operationalized the questions that Matt shared and we borrowed. Next slide, please. Great. To help answer the first question, Colorado engaged a vendor to complete a capacity analysis. This analysis helped us to identify which strategies were suitable for sustaining and the resources needed to sustain those strategies. This is a very important exercise for a few reasons. First, it helped check our assumptions. As we developed our renewal grant application, we identified which strategies would require ongoing investment and which activities did not. In some cases, we were wrong. They did take a little more level of effort to maintain the tools or systems that we were developing. So it's great to go through that exercise and understand that true investment. Second, the capacity analysis highlighted the impact PDG strategies have on existing staff. We now understand the degree to which program managers not funded through the grant are taking on additional work and the expected impact once funding ends. We really wanted to understand if we were going to realize any efficiencies and replace existing work, or if we were creating net new work. Finally, this analysis helped us make data-informed decisions. While the process was not exact, it did provide us with a list of key tasks that must continue and the staffing required to complete those tasks. Through this analysis, we identified about 23 strategies that were suitable for sustaining. Next slide, please. So this is the tool that we use to complete the capacity analysis. Over the course of about 20 or so meetings, project leads met with our vendor to discuss the high-level tasks required to implement each strategy and the amount of time necessary to complete each task. Tasks highlighted in green are the ones we hope will continue post PDG, while activities in red are those that will end with the grant. In this example, 2 individuals are currently working on these strategies, and we were able to determine the current workload is equivalent to about 34% of 1 FTE. If we sustain the activity at the same level, we'll require about 30% of 1 FTE to maintain this level of activity. Through this activity, we also identified that the current implementation of all strategies is taking about 30 FTE, but ongoing needs will be closer to 12 FTE. This has been really important in helping to understand right-sizing the PDG grant work moving forward and made it a lot more palatable to our stakeholders. They're no longer thinking that they have to maintain this huge staff that we're funding under PDG or invest at the same level moving forward. Next slide, please. So following the capacity analysis, we built out a larger document, what we call a sustainability crosswalk, that captured each PDG strategy, the suitability of that strategy for sustainability, which we labeled level of investment, and the resources needed, both FTE and other costs like contracts and supplies. We did include additional pieces of information that would assist in decision-making, including the target audience for each strategy, the outcomes each strategy is working towards, and a description of the post-grant tasks or activities. Next slide, please. Next, we began to address the second question regarding what is desirable for the state to sustain. The Office of Early Childhood recently underwent a leadership change. Our new director developed 6 strategies that are guiding policy and funding decisions for our office. Additionally, the Governor's Office develops annual wildly important goals, or WIGs, for each agency that shape our priorities and work. We crosswalked each PDG strategies to these frameworks and goals to provide a clear visual of how sustaining or expanding PDG activities will help to meet the state's strategic vision. Next slide, please. Finally, we identified the policy and funding opportunities to address the feasibility of sustaining each strategy. Within the sustainability crosswalk document, we listed new or existing policies and funding streams and noted where PDG strategies aligned. This has been especially helpful as we look at new legislation and funding. Since PDG work is already in progress, we're able to very quickly meet requirements and to stand up structures to help spend dollars that need to be spent on a shorter timeline. Next slide, please. So thinking about next steps, we have made quite a bit of progress since developing the sustainability crosswalk tool. First, we identified our agency leaders as key decision makers. These are the same individuals that guide decisions for the various policy and funding sources identified in the crosswalk. Next, we built out a timeline to determine when decisions must be made based on each funding stream. For example, strategies that may be sustained through stimulus funding were discussed in late summer. Strategies that will be sustained through state general fund are currently under discussion in alignment with our legislative session. While we have documented these decisions in our crosswalk tool, I will begin to translate this information into a more formal report that can be shared with stakeholders. We do plan to revisit this regularly to account for any changes in desirability or feasibility. So similar to Matt, that was a really quick overview of what Colorado has done, and I appreciate the opportunity to share. And I think we're moving into a question and answer period.
Thank you both so much. We are moving into question and answer, and actually you can unmute yourself and speak directly. We really would love to have your feedback. I mean, I kind of if I was in a state position, I would just want to like borrow Lindsay and Matt and say, come help me. But what I'll kick off a question, and then I'll hope that you all will have some questions. I mean, both of the approaches are really very impressive and very thorough. What's interesting to me is the structure. So for Matt, he is working within state agency, but more or less for the focal, the state of the office and the leadership team, if I understand that correctly. And Lindsay, you seem like you're inside the agency, hired a consultant to support you, but you're driving that. So I think that's probably also one of the initial decisions to be made of, what is going to be the role of the PDG manager and whether you're going to use consultants or contractors. And I wonder whether Matt and or Lindsay could briefly tell us a bit about why you made the choice you made.
I could chime in, and you're
Okay.
right, Lori. The unit that I work for is in effect an in-house consulting firm. And I wasn't privy to that decision. They contacted us and I said, you bet, we're all set. We'll get your proposal and the rest of it. But I got the sense that there was a hope that by pulling us in to do the sustainability planning, it wouldn't get lost with the PDG work itself, because the overall manager and the key people at each of the agencies, as well as the project leads, really had their hands full. And this was a way for them to tap some additional folks who could come in with a little bit of an outside perspective.
Great, thank you. Lindsay?
Yeah, so ours, we've always managed PDG within our Department of Human Services Office of Early Childhood. And so I think part of the decision was capacity and who had the time to take this on and organize and push. But also, again, the decision making around a lot of the funding sources or policy choices that are going to be made that would support sustainability are held within our agency. And so it made sense for us internally to really take a deep look and build out those pathways to sustainability. And then where we do need to engage, the governor's office or our state advisory council, we do. But for a lot of this decision making, we're able to centralize that work. In terms of hiring a vendor, they really focused on the capacity analysis. So we had actually engaged them for another project within PDG. They had extra hours, and we decided that this was a good use of their time to really help us understand what the inputs were to implement the work, and then how we would right size that moving forward.
Thank you. I think most of you know, Colorado is going through a transition of their state agency structure. There's a new Department of Early Childhood, which will be stood up, I think, next summer. New funding for both for preschool and possibly others. So you really had to adapt to changing conditions, and then you had a new leadership. I thought your examples of the matrices that you did were really, really helpful. To me, that was a sign of how you possibly approach things, but also how you adapted to changing conditions so you could pivot and show leadership how these efforts really align to what they wanted to do. Do you want to make did I get that right? Interpret that correctly? And did you want to make any other comment on that?
Yeah, that is spot on, Lori. The tool that we worked on really was, a lot of the intent behind it was to meet leadership or decision makers where they were at. And so how did we illustrate that PDG fit into new or evolving vision? And that tool was really helpful in doing that.
Great. Matt, I don't know if you can, I have one, I don't see any questions, so let me stop for a minute and see if anybody, okay, great. Judy, thank you so much. Will you continue to utilize your state advisory councils or early childhood councils in identifying and vetting efforts that will be sustained. And then the second part of that question is, where do you include parent voice and input? If at all, actually at this level of the sustainability planning. So maybe Matt and or Lindsay want to respond to the question. Really, it's about who's providing input and how. And Matt, you might want to mention a little bit more about your process of how you provide, you got input from lots of people through the survey and everything.
Lindsay, do you want to go first, or?
Sure, I can. So I think the simple way to think about this is that we continue each year to take a look at our strategic plan. And so each year we bring together a working group under our State Advisory Council, whose focus is to review the statewide strategic plan and provide any updates to that plan. In addition, Colorado developed a 5-year plan with the intent that it would allow for sustainability of the PDG investment. So it wasn't going to end at 3 years or follow the same timeline as the grant. And so through that work group, we do have parents seated on that. We also established a Family Voice Council for the office through PDG, who are doing a separate review of the strategic plan, just to make sure that those strategies are still relevant and meaningful as we move forward.
I just want to point out that we talked about that a little bit earlier about the size of the group, and who's influencing the development of the plan versus who you engage to provide input, have review. So that's a nice way of talking about that and having that family voice look at it, or whatever it might be, the home visitors look at it, so that the perspective of a certain perspectives are reflected in the plan. But Matt, do you want to talk about it?
Yeah, it was, I walked through a number of different steps, and it was that third step that really brought in the advisory councils in Minnesota. And that was going out to 70 different contacts and saying, hey, about some of these PDG elements, and can you give us your sense for how important, how well positioned, and what we should do about these levers as we think about supplying the 11 PDG elements that we want to move forward with. And so they were engaged in those at that stage. I will say that there's a variety of people involved in those advisory councils. Many of them are stakeholders from organizations rather than necessarily parents, for example, although there are some parents are involved. Going into the project, we wondered about that and looked at building that in. And the feeling was that having gone through a very, very extensive year-plus process of engaging at that parent level, at that individual level, in communities throughout the state, that there was a lot of information that went into shaping what was part of the PDG funded work. And so it wasn't, when we came, it was less a qualitative call, especially as it turned out, since all 11 of them moved forward. It was more about what was suitable to sustain. And so the feeling was that because that outreach had so driven where Minnesota went with its efforts, that there wasn't a need for an elaborate and time-consuming process of public engagement for this.
Thank you. We have just a few more minutes of a question before we turn to Christina and Tom for their reflections and this work they're doing in their state. But this is from Guam. If you could give an example of a specific PDG work or outcomes you chose to sustain. I think, Lindsay, you spoke about the specific FTEs. And I don't know, Matt, if you're actually at that place yet, but if either of you would like to respond, I think folks are trying to kind of visualize in their head how you get to the specific work or outcomes that you are choosing to sustain. Are you at that place yet?
Yes, we have begun our, I guess, our decision-making process where we're reviewing each of the strategies that would be considered suitable for sustaining, and then determining whether or not there's a priority to do that. And we've actually identified pathways for every one of those 23 strategies that we've defined as suitable. And so we haven't really made decisions in terms of like, no, we're not going to continue this work, which has been really promising for me and the leads. So in terms of like the work that, like some of the outcomes or activities that we're sustaining, you know, we're really focused on capacity building and access. So thinking about supports for early care and education providers. And then the workforce is a huge priority, especially as we're moving towards universal preschool. So those definitely were moving forward. Where I would say I had to fight, if I did have to fight and advocate, it was for anything that we really considered to be a pilot, because we didn't have a plan when writing our application to sustain that. And we're still not at a point where we have good outcome data to determine whether or not there's value in expanding that work. So a lot of decisions around that are, you know, we'll push that decision out a year when we have more data, or we'll look at some partners who are starting to pick up similar activities and see if they can carry that work forward.
Thank you. Matt, did you want to make any other comment on that question?
You know, I'll just quickly to give you a sense for the kinds of things that we did reach that we're working to sustain. Some of them are very problematic. Some of them are really smart strategies if you're doing public programs work. So they include things like the early childhood data portal, so the eligibility alignment, help me connect community solutions grants for healthy child development, community resource hubs. But it also includes work that's being done on early childhood workforce. It includes continuing ongoing community engagement that got started so well before the PDG grant came in. And then at least this phase of it, things like collaborating with tribal nations and staffing for cross-agency work.
Well, thank you both so much. Really appreciate sharing what you're learning, what you've done, and answering questions. And I know others may have other questions we may follow up, but now we're going to actually ask Christina LaChance from New Hampshire, who did participate in the work group and really as a learning experience. So this is all to make you feel comfortable that you don't actually have to have, you know, really started the process, but there may be a need to really understand the process and get everybody ready to go before you kind of, you know, start moving it forward. So Christina will give her reflections on how New Hampshire is approaching it, what she learned, and then Tom, who didn't participate in the work group, but Illinois was part of it, Jamila and another colleague was on the work group. He will do the same, so that you see you see examples of people at different places in the sustainability planning process. So Christina, we'd love to have you share your reflections.
Sure. Thank you, and thank you to Minnesota and Colorado. My goodness. Some of you may know that in New Hampshire we embarked on an early childhood governance system transformation over the last year. So just before the pandemic, our Governor Sununu, announced the formation of the Council for Thriving Children to help advise, certainly on the preschool development grant, as well as all sorts of other grants that are in New Hampshire and touching down at the same time related to early childhood. So really a number of activities. The council and the PDG grant are housed at the University of New Hampshire. So in New Hampshire, that looks a lot different than typical grants that we've received, especially in the early childhood space. So the university is the state's premier research university. It's also the land grant university. And hopefully, and what I'm finding since my transition there about a year ago, is really a plethora of information, and really want to help folks think about this work by looking at data and looking at research rather than just kind of opinion and what's working from a financial standpoint, right? They really want to understand how the data can be used to drive decision-making in our state. So the council was formed, and I was brought in. My background is across early childhood in almost every single space, childcare, early intervention, pediatric medication and rehabilitation services, et cetera. So I've really worked across all of those different spaces. So in my view, when I came from my last stop, which was in philanthropy, New Hampshire was really ripe for this opportunity, both with the PDG grant and the startup of the council. So we spent the initial year really doing a lot of startup activities. So as you would imagine, we had to form the council. We started meeting online, so no one got to meet each other in person for almost a year, which had its own challenges. I was hired. I subsequently hired other staff. We created a year in review. We updated the strategic plan. We began to work with the Department of Education, as well as Health and Human Services and the Governor's Office, who are all in this work together with families and on-site providers and community folks. So suffice it to say, during this startup period, although we were doing all sorts of really cool stuff, a lot of it was relationship building, building trust, and really resetting the stage from, and I don't want to say resetting, but really building on what we had already had in New Hampshire in the past. So for us, we were not in a place to begin that work by talking about sustainability, especially with the relationships that kind of needed to come into place. For me personally, sustainability is something that's always been of interest, especially because I have worked in so many federal, local, and state-funded projects through the year. But I quickly recognized that although I personally was super interested in sustainability work, it was frightening for most people, especially in the beginning. So the infrastructure that we really worked on in the last year, I know will help us move forward. But again, I knew and I learned so much by participating in that first round of sustainability planning, especially how I could use the language that Colorado and Minnesota was using to, I suppose, sell, and maybe that's not the right word, but to sell this idea of a sustainability plan over the course of the last year to key decision makers who would be willing to participate. So I learned a lot through the sessions, but it also definitely made me realize we were not far enough along. So we have developed this council now. It does have 4 key quadrants. So I've heard folks talking today about some of the ways that you were able to get input. And certainly we have a needs assessment, a strategic plan, all the things that you're supposed to have. But the 4 quadrants of New Hampshire's early childhood governance structure include early integration teams at both Department of Ed and Department of Health and Human Services. So those are 2 of the quadrants. Those are where decisions get made, right, at the departments. We have a quadrant of scientific early childhood panel experts. So those are our university folks, our pediatricians, et cetera. And then we have a parent leadership group. So whatever we come up with in terms of beginning our sustainability work, and we certainly will listen to Lori's good advice about keeping it small in terms of really needing to dig deep and figure out what we want to sustain, what makes sense to sustain. But then we will have all of these quadrants and the system that we've been designing in the last year to put this information out to people, to get feedback, and to really understand how we might move forward. So again, I think that although it was really clear to me that we were not, New Hampshire just was not a participant in Race to the Top or any of the former large early childhood investments, and we were just so early on, it became clear to me we needed to do the work, that I was super interested, but I was going to need to build trust and sell it to a whole host of people. So I'm happy to report today, although we still have a ton of work ahead of us, I am going to participate in the next strategic planning TA group. I have garnered the full-fledged support of Department of Education, Department of Health and Human Services leadership, and the governor's office will also participate in the process. So although I'm not so thrilled as Colorado and Minnesota today, because their work is just really incredible. I know for New Hampshire, we had to take this last year to work out the startup of this transformational new system before we could move into a sustainability planning phase. So I'm pretty excited to get going with the planning process, both working with PDG TA resources, but also having now the support of our team. I will say, in terms of Colorado and Minnesota, I did hear a lot through the last year, and we have decided that we are going to create an RFP and bring someone in to help us. We haven't quite decided if it'll be with the capacity work or the writing work. We're working that out in the next couple of weeks. It is our goal, however, to have an RFP posted at UNH's website by November 1st so that we can get started on this work in earnest in January. So thank you so much. I wish I had more to say. I can't wait for next year so that I can talk about the ways I copied. Thank you again, Colorado and Minnesota, for letting us share and steal your ideas. Really appreciated.
We really appreciated you sharing, Christina, and showcasing a good example of that is part of the process, building the trust and the relationships. So I want to turn it to Tom, because Illinois really has done quite a lot of the work about identifying priorities through various commissions and reports, and he's been shepherding internally the work there. So he'll share that with you right now and where they're looking to go as well. And so we'll take about 5 minutes for Tom to share before we then go into breakout groups, where you will also then be able to talk more with each of the presenters, each of the 4 presenters. So thanks, Tom.
Well, thank you, Lori. So I am Tom Lehman. I'm the QRIS Policy Director in Illinois, and in PDG B-5, I manage our Activity 5 quality projects. I'm so happy to be following Christina. I didn't realize she was going to set up my comments. We started in a different position. I think we had, as Lori was just kind of saying, we had long-term goals and plans before the PDG B-5 grant opportunity presented itself. And so we were able to incorporate some of them. And so we had already started thinking about long-term. So we were able to incorporate some sustainability ideas right from the beginning. What happens, though, as you probably know, is great plans don't always happen the way you planned them. And so right from the beginning, we started to identify obstacles and had to adjust as that went on. So let me just give you one example from my work. One of our projects, we're piloting a new way of funding child care centers, a new form of contracts that our Department of Human Services would be issuing. And so in the initial planning, one of our main planners was the head of child care at the Department of Human Services. And we talked about, how these contracts could work, they would issue them. And then I talked with her about what kind of staffing they would need to administer this. And she said, well, it's a short-term project. We can't staff up for a short-term project. You're going to have to do that from your office. So I start thinking about, okay, but I want you to build the capacity. So when this is over, your agency can do it. She said, well, it's a pilot anyway. We don't have results yet and so on. But if the results are positive, we'll pretty much commit to sustaining it. So 2 years in, the results are very positive. We've changed direction a couple of times in fairly radical ways, but everybody's very happy with what we have now. So, so I'm back to the Department of Human Services talking about the same question. And now we're actually making progress. So we have analyzed our own staffing, how that would need to be changed or adapted within the department, and we're moving on from there. So I think my point is just that you never know where you can start in the process and where it's going to get you, but the earlier you start, the better. I think so. I really had 2 points I wanted to make. That was one of them. As part of grant activities to really build the capacity of either your state agencies or your vendors, the people doing the work to sustain it. Going back to experience with Race to the Top, which we did have several years ago, we had community collaborations that were funded, and we really did a lot of work with them about how they would be funded after the end of this. My second point is strategic communication about not only about what's been achieved, but about the path forward. In other words, we've achieved these things, and here's how the state or the local community can sustain it. Here's the plan for sustaining it. And my really brief example is that in Race to the Top, we ended up with, for each of our activities, a 2-pager, which we printed as back-to-back, if anybody reads printing, and just snapshot of here's what we did and here's how it's sustained. Hard to write. I had to write one of them, and I ended up using a newspaper writer to help me. And so that's only those 2 areas, I think, are what I wanted to highlight. And that's what I have. Lori or Stephanie?
Thank you so much. We really appreciate, well, hold on a minute. Yeah, okay, I'm not muted, right? This technology is always interesting, whether you're muted or not muted.
Mhm. Yeah. Okay, so we are going to move into breakout rooms. And thank you very much, Christina and Tom, and Lindsay and Matt. Those were great conversations and sharing on what you've been doing. So the breakout discussions. So we are actually going to try to just tackle 2 questions, which are questions 3 and 4. What is one concrete next step that you would take to move forward in planning for sustainability? And then what tools and resources do you need to support sustainability planning? So we're going to go ahead and move into the breakout rooms for about 15 minutes. And then we'll come back and share out. So, okay, there we go. Stop sharing my screen.
Hi, Stephanie. We're not being moved to a breakout room. Should we assume we're in the room that you want us in?
If you called into today's session from your phone, um, please make sure that you have called in such a way that you can enter the breakout room.
They told us to leave, but they might not have thought it was time.
Yeah. Yeah. Mm. How many do we have back? I think we're all back.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, yeah.
Right. Well, I'm sorry about that. I thought it was you, but well,
No. Yeah, so, and we've got only 9 minutes left, so probably we just probably
Okay,
need to
real
do that
quick.
for 5 minutes, because
I think it'd be really helpful, just because it will set up a stage for what we might want to continue to work on. I think as an annual convening and a workshop really like surfaces the issues and increases some awareness of tools, but we had a really good conversation about more or less how you make a decision about what may not get it sustained if a partner has a real, allegiance to whatever the project might be. And that made me think about adding that to my list of like more or less things you have to do before you actually dig in, is to develop ground rules for decision making. And then we had Wendy and Nebraska and Mariana in our group. They participated last time really as a listener and learner, and now they're in a different place. So they're really planning to kind of move forward on sustainability planning. We didn't get a chance to discuss with others where they were at, North Carolina and Illinois. So I'll ask Stephanie, why don't you go ahead and share where your group is at?
Okay. We talked through what are some next steps. We had one state that was having a consultant look at the strategic plan and needs assessment and alignment with the legislative and governor's priorities, and they were kind of looking at what Colorado did with that capacity analysis. Another state has a steering committee looking at the work in the strategic plan to kind of look at what to sustain. And then one state also was actually built sustainability questions in their performance evaluation plan and have developed a checklist, trying to help determine what needs funding. Those were kind of the key takeaways.
Okay, so Lindsay is going, excuse me, so sorry. Amanda is going to report out for Lindsay's group. I think she may have had to hop off.
I am right here. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, excellent. So we also had a partner from North Carolina highlight that they are looking at incorporating some of these sustainability considerations, or that they are incorporating these into their evaluation planning. Which is a great idea that I'm going to take back. Other next steps really revolved around planning to plan, which we noted was a common theme in preschool development grant work. So really refreshing on the current status of sustainability planning and pulling together the input that's been provided by program managers to date, bringing these ideas from this conversation back to coordination team. And then we talked a little bit about the current context, recognizing that 14 months goes by really quickly in state or federal government. And recognizing also that this obviously coincides with just a massive influx of federal relief dollars at the state and local levels. So we talked through that a little bit and highlighted that especially if we are providing some grants to local communities, that those might be good places to prioritize finding alternative sources of funding sooner rather than later to avoid that cliff in terms of services provided at the local level.
Thank you, Amanda. And Karen Oliver from South Carolina is going to report for the group that Matt was leading. So Karen?
I'm not sure if Karen she may be having internet issues, so I was gonna
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, for our group, we talked very similar things of what Amanda shared. Some of us, we had a bit of a conversation about how do we find those activities that need to be sustained, and pinpointing what those specific activities would be at a project level, and understanding the numerous and many kinds of activities, and that's a bit of a challenge. And then the other part of understanding what needs to be sustained at more of a policy and a systematic change level, and what are those larger pictures that we want to move forward as we want to sustain this work. And so we had that two kind of contrasting type of conversation, and we did get talk a little bit about tools and needing a variety of different kinds of tools. I think our other states would maybe could share a bit, because we didn't really get into that question. But yeah, looking at the larger picture and then understanding what are those activities that need to move forward, and understanding capacity of those that are moving those activities forward.
So we're going to have tools and templates, and both some that we've gathered and used, and also from Colorado, and you'll get to see all that. And I know Hawaii is part of the work group, but if you're not part of the work group and you still want to see the tools and even some examples of sustainability plans, obviously not from PDG B-5, but from others, just so you kind of see what is the range of how folks approached it, particularly from the Race to the Top. You can email us and ask for that, or whoever is your TA liaison, you can go ahead and ask them that. And that's our role, is here to support you. Where Stephanie and I and the team feel pretty strongly about the importance of sustainability planning as part of your strategic planning, evaluation, financing process. So I'll turn it over to Stephanie to close this out, but it's been a really great conversation and sharing, and really, really thank the presenters, Christina, Tom, Matt, and Lindsay, for being willing to share what they've done and where they're going.
Yeah.
Thanks, Stephanie.
Absolutely. So just real quickly, we just wanted to point out the sustaining finance resources, and Lori talked earlier about emailing Sam for the work group, and this is actually the website, and I've actually put the link in the chat where you can find the sustaining finance resources, and just any other topics that you might find of interest. And we also wanted to share the childcare and early education resource connections. That link is also in the chat, and you can basically browse by topic. The focus of the convening was data systems. We had data systems, equity, finance, governance, social, emotional, special populations, coordination and integration. So you can find a lot of more resources there as well. So that concludes our session, and just want to thank you all for joining us, and thank you to the presenters again, and really hope you can join that sustainability work group. It is wonderful. I know, co-leading with Lori this last year, I really learned a lot, and I think you can see the excitement from the states that presented today. So I hope everyone has a wonderful afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Stephanie. Bye. Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye.